Thank you very much, Mary. This is a terrible topic I got to live with. Let me just say offhand that I'm very pleased to be here. I often think it'd be wonderful to get licked in this business, and then I could go back to teaching, which is what I've always kind of wanted to do and never done. And I'm always refreshed to come back to a college campus. Believe it or not, you're going to like this place after you leave it. I always remember I went to Amherst, which is a little school just about this size, 11 or 1,200 students. The only thing wrong with Amherst, it had no women, but other than that, it was a great liberal arts school. And I always remember how glad I was to get out of the place after 4 years. And now I spend most of my time wanting to go back there, and they'll never invite me. I got to be governor or something before you get back to these colleges. So I am pleased to be here and try to wrestle a little bit with some of the problems that I try to work with as a politician, and to try to perhaps stimulate some questions that you may have when I'm all through. As you know, I'm noted for being fairly outspoken, and so don't hesitate as I go along. If you have any questions, I don't mind if you stop me, or if you want to wait, fine. We can go at it at the end. Because basically, I'm going to try to wrestle with the problem of how politicians make decisions in a society such as ours. And I don't know a lot about it myself. I haven't been in it that long. And I'm not sure in many areas that I'm right. And consequently, I hope that you won't hesitate to criticize me, because I'm sure you won't. And we'll remember that this is a good learning process for me as well as for you. The history of man, it seems to me, in the last, 300 years, has been, in terms of the industrial and technological revolution, nothing but one series of magnificent successes. I always have to sit and talk to my father, who's a doctor and nearing 80, how he tells me in his lifetime we've gone from the horse and buggy to the rocket, or from the scribes to the computer, from they had a recoilless cannon was invented the year my father was born. This was going to end all wars, just like Mr. Nobel invented dynamite. And this was going to end all wars because it was such a terrible weapon. The only thing is, it was used about 6 months later, and Mr. Nobel became a multimillionaire selling dynamite to every known nation, I suspect. But we've gone from that to the hydrogen bomb, from the medicine man, basically, and the chemist, so to speak, the Shakespearean and other eras, to the modern doctor and the almost incredible scientific developments in terms of the biophysics, chemistry, and so on and so forth. And alongside this, you kind of look at the development of various forms of democratic government, and during this same 300 period, there haven't been many successes. As a matter of fact, I've heard some call it almost a history of failure. And this is kind of frightening, that on the one hand, man can double and redouble knowledge, and on the other hand, he can't live with himself or his fellow man. And the fact that you can take knowledge and technology and use it as a Hitler did to kill 120,000 mental patients, or 7 million Jews, Poles, Yugoslavs, and many others, in a Christian nation, half Protestant and half Catholic, so-called, in a nation where they had great intellect, great scientists, poets, writers, all the rest, only goes to show that with regard to how we govern ourselves, we got an awful long way to go. And, or to put it another way, maybe, we can develop a computer, and if you want to remember, when I graduated from high school in 1946, there was only one computer in America. When I graduated from college, there were 6. And today, and that was 1950 when I left college, and today there are 12,000 computers in the United States. As a matter of fact, the computer they developed in 1951 to take care of the census has been relegated to the Smithsonian Institute. It's kind of like the dinosaurs. They've replaced it with another machine that can do 100 times what this machine could do, and this machine was taking the place of 750 clerks and accountants and what all they had working in this particular area. So you can develop a computer that can do the work of 750 clerks, but we have an awful lot of trouble living together, just to mention the racial problems today. In this country, the problems of militarism, the problems of technological advances which have never been geared into a society. The one country really, or one of the few countries that have been able to handle change really reasonably well has been our own. And this has been terribly important, I think, and even more important in the sense that the American experience is in many ways the experience of taking people of different ethnic, religious, and social groups and bringing them together under one flag and in one nation. This is something you learn as you move around Minnesota. I grew up on the top of Pill Hill in Rochester. None of you probably know much about Pill Hill, but this is where the doctors live. And it's a very conservative, traditional area of Rochester where they know me best, they vote for me least. I hardly knew there was, I had probably never knew anything about Judaism. Catholics were fairly evil, as I recall, in the community. And I'd never heard of a Mennonite. I'd never seen a Slovenian or a Finn, and I hardly knew really much about the world in which I was soon to live in. It was a very secluded society, and when I've moved around Minnesota, if I've learned nothing else, it's that we're a land of diversity. We have people from all walks of life, from almost every conceivable nationality and ethnic group, and they all have a contribution to make, and that this is kind of the American experience. Unless we can do the same for the Negro, this nation can never really basically achieve the ultimate, in my judgment, the greatness that I think is necessary if we're to maintain a position of leadership in terms of people who believe fundamentally in a certain degree of individual freedom. So this, it seems to me, is what we've got to study is how our political system, how decisions can be made at a time when, one, we're changing so rapidly. And I can't emphasize this enough, because if basically the whole economy of Minnesota has changed just since I grew up. A farm today is not the same as it was 20 years ago, a modern farm in Minnesota. We never had a taconite plant 20 years ago in Minnesota. We had no electronic industries. We'd never heard of flight systems for rockets in Minnesota, and we make almost all of them now, right within a few thousand yards practically of where we're sitting tonight. This industry now employs some 50,000 people and didn't employ a soul 20 years ago. We make one of our most productive crops today is the soybean. This, by the way, came from China, Japan, and now we're selling almost vast quantities of these beans to our enemy, the Japanese. Matter of fact, not only do we sell them to the Japanese, but we employ people to go around the villages of Japan to show the housewives how to use it. You can even make milk out of soybeans today. And these beans are floated down the Mississippi and shipped all the way to Japan. Or I could take you up to Duluth tomorrow and show you wheat grown in western Minnesota that's being sold to 50 nations of the world. Or that oil-producing plant down in soybean oil plant that dumped the oil into the Mississippi River, caused all the problems with the ducks. That's the largest oil-producing plant in the world. In terms of as a matter of fact, the price of oil on the world market, soybean oil dropped 1/4 cent the day that thing cracked open. And that never existed 20 years ago today. And so all I can say is that we're going through this tremendously complex and changing society of ours, and if we can't handle this change, not only in terms of ourselves personally, but in terms of being able to govern ourselves, I think we're going to be in for a lot of difficulty. And change is not easy under the best of circumstances, and most of us don't like to change, I guess, very well. And yet change we must. And basically, right now, whether this nation likes it or not, it is the leader. And leadership requires, in my judgment, a great deal more, perhaps, than not being the leader. It requires a lot more knowledge, a lot more humbleness in many ways, a lot more capacity to change and to understand and to be understanding. And I think you have to make the certain basic decisions, and you have to understand the kind of process that you're dealing with politically, because it's tough to change. And politically, it's just about as tough as any system I've ever seen. And it always amazes me that when I hear some of my conservative friends bemoaning that we liberals are taking over the world, come on over to the legislature. Try to put a bill through it. It took us 8 years to get withholding. It took us, matter of fact, there hasn't been a major piece of legislation passed except in an extreme emergency such as a depression. It didn't take years and years and years of constant effort, even though it was clear the vast majority of people wanted it. So I think it's very important for you people now to kind of really, you aren't going to have many opportunities to really question and analyze your basic philosophic and political principles. Once you get out of here, let me tell you something. You got to earn a living, you're going to have kids, and if you want to talk to my wife about what it's like to have a few running around, she's here tonight, and it takes a lot of time, and you aren't going to have the time to reflect and to study and to question, and you better take the opportunity now. And I want you to remember that the political system is, in a sense, your system. And if this nation fails, and there's nothing in past history to say a democracy is going to survive, most of them have died. The history of free people is not a very encouraging one. If you want to look at it very objectively, totalitarianism just stands right around the corner in almost every land, and in a half or 2/3 of the world, it's got full control of the political apparatus. I think so I just wanted to give you this kind of background. You may think this is a little too serious, but this is a serious business. And I want you to be able to really come to grips with what fundamentally are you when you talk politics. And I think you start right basically with what do you consider man's nature to be? Is he wicked? Is he without judgment? Has he no reason? What basically do you think a human being, an adult human being, is capable of doing? Walter Lippmann has spelled it out many times, in many ways, but he's always asked the question, are adult men and women to be regarded as having that freedom of will which makes them personally responsible for their conduct? Ultimately, a totalitarian does not believe this. I don't care how he gets at it, how he arrives at his concept. Ultimately, a totalitarian must believe or comes to the conclusion that the ends justify any means. And this ultimately, if you follow it down, and I've got some philosophers here, I'm a little afraid to get into this area, but basically it seems to me if you follow this, it means you ultimately, man has no dignity, you use him. You're like a Rockwell who talked at the university recently, and what he said was very interesting. He said, I never appeal to a man's reason. I appeal to his emotions. I go to the bars, and I talk to him about the Negroes and the Jews and this and that. He says, we got to rise up and take over, and it's going to be these kind of guys that do it. And basically, if you've ever read Hitler's philosophy, and he studied the German personality very carefully. Matter of fact, he perhaps knew it as well as anyone. And he acted very, very intelligently on what he thought this personality what would be. And he thought that there was no such thing as freedom of will, that man needed and ought to be governed, and that man was basically evil and needed to be controlled and ordered. And most totalitarians really fundamentally get right down to this. This is what they really do think. And they come at it from all kinds of different directions, sometimes through religion, sometimes ignoring religion, sometimes through their political processes, and as I said, in many different means. We've always said in this country, we've always asserted, I should say, the natural or inalienable rights of men and nations. We've given them the right. I always have that Declaration of Independence on my wall of my law office because it's the most radical document that perhaps was ever written in this country, one of them certainly. And it says you can rise up, you can strike down dictators and tyrants, that revolution is justified under certain circumstances. But I think one thing you've got to remember, this is only the negative aspect of people who are struggling and who believe that man has a certain degree of free will, can make certain judgments, and has to stick with them. In other words, has to decide, make certain value judgments, and then has to pay for those acts of commission or omission. But basically, you're not really free when you're released from tyranny. In other words, when you get your freedom, you're only freed. And you're never free until you realize, in my judgment, that you have a certain power and duty to choose between certain alternatives, and that you have to be responsible and accountable for the choices you make. And if you believe this, and maybe psychiatry will destroy this, maybe economic determinism, some form of it, will ultimately, maybe there is some truth in this, I don't know, but as yet I don't think there's any data to say that this isn't right, any clear data. Therefore, if you believe this, then I think you're at least on the way to becoming or understanding the responsibilities of a free citizen in a free country. And if you believe this and understand this, I think you must take some interest, basically, in the political system, because fundamentally, the political power to elect people is in your hands. And if you take it seriously, then, of course, you have to, you are, in a certain sense, responsible for who you elect. This is why I suppose I believed that it was essential to bring to justice certain men in Germany who committed the most serious atrocities. This is not to say that I didn't believe that Germany shouldn't be brought back as a free nation. But in other words, you don't temper justice with some mercy. Or like the Salvation Army people say, the man may be down, but he's never out. That you don't try to, that things can't change. But it does mean that you have to stand accountable. If you ever read the biography or the biography of Eichmann, you would kind of understand the feeling I'm trying to get across, that here was a man that could watch the kids and the mothers and the families walk into the gas chambers crying and struggling and marching into their death and never move a muscle. Show absolutely no emotion. Could stand on the witness stand and say that he was only obeying orders, and basically this is a totalitarian. If you could do this, and a lot of people can, they can sure watch their brothers go down the drain. It's very easy. It's a lot easier to go with a crowd, let me tell you, when things get tough. Fundamentally, if you're ever going to be a basically free person, you're going to have to make some of these judgments, and they may ultimately, and I think will, decide the political concepts that we adopt in the future and attempt to wrestle with the problems of the future. So fundamentally, most of our politicians, in a sense, really do believe this. And this is what makes them the kind of people that they are. And a politician always is aware that he's there, if he's worth anything, by the consent of the governed. And this is something he always wrestles with. Anything he says or anything he does, he must remember that ultimately he has to come before the people to which he says it or does it or affects them, and he will ultimately be tested with the ballot box. And that ultimately, or every 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, he must go to the people and try to get elected. And this means that he can't, this doesn't mean that he just reads the polls. There are politicians that just do that. I've been over at the legislature where some guy gets 50 letters for a bill and 10 against it, he votes for it. His concept of a politician is that he reflects what the people tell him. He's their representative. This is a very deep-seated feeling in any politician. And consequently, some of them are not the great educators that they ought to be, because fundamentally they're going to know more about basic public policy than the average citizen, and they have a responsibility. And fundamentally, every politician learns very early in his career that public opinion can be wrong and arbitrary, many times short-sighted. My great example, and this is, I think, every politician's example, when I used to come down, I was a state senator for 4 years, representing Rochester and Olmsted County, which is about 90 miles south of here, for those of you who don't know the state too well. And every time I came back from the sessions, it was always the same. We never did enough for Rochester. The state hospital didn't get enough money, and they never did. That's true. We aren't building the roads fast enough between Minneapolis and Rochester. We're still working on that 4-lane highway and will be until 1967. We never got the airport completed fast enough. We're always doing too much for Minneapolis and St. Paul and the Iron Range, and taxes are too high. This is and a little exaggeration, but basically there's a lot of truth to what I'm saying. People want a lot for themselves. They want good public services. On the one hand, they're not so sure they want them for anybody else, and they don't want to pay for them unless they have to, unless somebody else pays for them. So the politician has this responsibility on the one hand to lead, and yet the delicate task on the other hand that he can't basically offend too many people and too many groups. And he's always, on the one hand, has to guide and control public opinion, and the other hand, he has to woo it and court it. And so he's always in this area of trying to do what's right, and yet he knows that Franklin Roosevelt, said to him, you can't go faster than the people will let you. Or Thomas Jefferson's famous remark that great innovation should not be forced on slender majorities. But basically, our process is one of slow education and change. And consequently, he's always wrestling with principles on the one hand and political judgment on the other. He never wants to offend too many people because he's afraid if he does, he will ultimately be defeated. Politicians are not Joan of Arc. They're not out in front of the troops too much because they always feel they might get shot down. It's like the story my old first sergeant used to tell in the Marine Corps to all second lieutenants, of which I was one at one time. He said, if you want to live 10 seconds in combat, get 10 yards out in front of this platoon and tell them where to go. If you want to live 10 minutes, you get with the platoon and direct them. If you want to get back to the States, get 10, 15, 20 yards behind them and tell them where to go. Most of the lieutenants that are alive today took that advice. But basically, a politician is always wrestling with his conscience on the one hand and what he thinks or what he calls his common sense. He's always trying to be a keen judge of public opinion. He has to respect it. He has to appeal to it. And yet at the same time, if he's worth his salt, he must at times be called upon to change it or alter it or to at least control it. And I can think of many instances. I remember during the Berlin crisis when President Kennedy made the plea for bomb shelters. Holy mackerel, Rochester was building bomb shelters all over the bloomin' place. And then 6 months later, it was all over. In other words, the President's remark had immense impact on the construction of bomb shelters. The President Kennedy's decision to say what had to be said about the racial problem was an interesting one. Apparently he wrestled with it for a long time. When to make the remarks? When could he use the office of presidency to be effective in terms of seeing to it that justice was arrived at far more speedily than many people wanted it to be arrived at? And he waited until the build-up, and he did this very consciously, until the build-up came mainly from the Negro community itself, and waited until the situation became rather serious in the summer, as you recall, and then made the famous statement, which was the first statement ever made by a President of the United States, defining, explaining, and attempting to set the pattern for the legislative proposals, which he then sent to the legislature within a few weeks following the statement. But he was very careful to pick his time on this. He knew that he was going to lose popularity, which he did immediately. But in the end, I think he felt that this had to be done, and ultimately, when you do what's right in politics, you'll generally come out on top. So basically what I'm saying is I don't believe you can be I don't believe a poor politician can ever be a good president or a good senator or a good governor. I think a politician is a man that really has to understand people. He has to be a part of them, really. You have to kind of identify with them. This is sometimes very hard to do because you've got to identify with people of all walks of life. You've got to learn to express in a way their aspirations. Sometimes they don't even express them very well themselves, but they all have them. This is one of the things I had to learn very hard way. When I first ran for office, Congressman Fraser told me the only way I'd get elected would be to go to every door in Rochester. This was a very conservative town. I happen to be a liberal, a Democrat. I don't like to use labels, but I put liberal. I'll define it for you if you want me to. And I went to every door. This took months of walking. I learned a number of things. I learned one thing: my wife was a far better housekeeper than I'd ever dreamed. She's really very good. I never criticize anymore. But I also learned that people aren't stupid. The average, so-called average person is a pretty unique and wonderful individual. He has his feelings and emotions, and frankly, his judgment, it doesn't really matter how big his house is, what kind of judgment he's got. As a matter of fact, my votes generally are related to elevation. The lower the elevation, the littler the houses, and the closer they are together, the better I like it. But fundamentally, you have to really be a part. It seems to me, you've got to realize that you're there by the consent of these people, and that these people can make a judgment, and they aren't going to know every facet of the political process, but that basically they can and will make a correct judgment. And when you look back over the history of the country, the people have picked some pretty interesting guys when things got tough. And when the nation needed a leader, somehow that popped out of there in this process that I'm trying to describe. Another thing you have to understand, it seems to me, about the political process is that all of us that call ourselves politicians are products of our background and economic ties and experience, whether it be legislative or executive or whatever experience we may have. I always remember going out to Los Angeles in 1960 for the first time to vote on the presidency. And I'd started in my own little precinct caucus and gone to the county convention, the state convention, and ultimately to the national convention. It never really dawned on me that I was out there to pick one of 1,000 some odd people, to pick the most powerful, the man who was going to run for the most powerful office in the history of the world. And I always remember I was met at the airport by Soapy Williams. I went out early. I was on a committee. The then governor of Michigan. And I was very fond of Soapy Williams. If for no other reason, he got elected 6 times. And any human being that can be a governor of a northern state and get himself elected 6 times, he's got to have some ability. And this man does. Believe me, he does. He's now in our State Department working on African affairs. He's a terribly interesting and able man. But the Kennedys knew that I liked Soapy Williams. The next thing I knew is Kenneth Galbraith invited me out to lunch. The man that wrote The Affluent Society, and I think that's a pretty good book. And the Kennedys knew that. As a matter of fact, the Kennedys knew more about me than I knew about myself. And basically, if you don't think this has an effect on a person, it does. And you are an emotional being, and your background and so forth is important. I always remember the story one of the most famous businessmen in Minnesota tells about Hubert Humphrey. In 1952, the Republicans took control of the Senate for the first time in many years, and the Agricultural Committee, Mr. Benson was trying to get through his agricultural policies, as you'll recall, and he never got to first base. And this man said, Hubert Humphrey sat there in a minority and controlled the Agricultural Committee of the United States Senate. Now, that's not easy to do. But what Senator Humphrey had done is he'd studied every man on that committee. He knew where he was from. He knew his whole background, where he grew up. He knew who elected him. He knew who opposed him. He knew what his background had been in politics, and he knew what to expect from every member of that committee. And just by this knowledge, and also being fairly astute himself on agricultural policies, he could in effect have far more influence than his number or than his political persuasion. And this is true of almost anyone. This was President Johnson's great capacity, was to understand the 97 other senators that were then, or 95 at that time. I don't know if Hawaii and Alaska had come in yet, but he understood probably far better than anyone the nature and the makeup of each politician. Harry Truman used to say, you dance with the girl that brung you. And most politicians know who brung them. They may not marry that girl, but they'll sure take her around the floor a few times, and they're not going to ignore the people that get them elected to public office. And then a politician has to live with media. And I don't know if you've ever had to live with public relations before. But let me tell you, when your life is open, everything you say is free for the public, it's a little different world than making a business decision in the Mayo Clinic or representing a client on a complicated business proposition. And you can't believe it until you have to live with this process. I always I take a number of newspapers just to kind of see what they do with what I say, because sometimes I can't recognize it after it gets filtered through the various processes of television or radio or the newspapers. President Kennedy was a great avid reader just to see how his statements were being interpreted by the various avenues of mass media, because he was hoping they were saying at least, or repeating what he thought he was saying. And communication, even at this intimate level, is terribly difficult. And a politician in a democratic society lives with almost in a fishbowl, not only his public statements, but a good deal of his private life. Just go out and have 2 beers too many, and find out they'll have you an alcoholic the next day. And it'll be all over Minnesota by the end of a week. And you'll spend the next 6 months without a beer. Then, fundamentally, the politician is terribly limited in a sense that, obviously, I'm a lawyer, and this is a very restricted field of human activity. And consequently, when you're electing a man to the presidency of the United States, think of the problems that he's got to wrestle with. What you're electing is a man who ultimately, as Truman always said, the buck stops here. Nothing that ever reaches President Johnson is easy. He will never have an easy decision from the day he became the president until the day he leaves. Because the easy decisions are all going to be solved by those below him, his advisors, the various department heads. It's only going to be when the rail strike is there, Mr. President, what are we going to do? Or when South Vietnam becomes just intolerable, what are we going to do? Or the Panamanians break off relations, what are we going to do? Or the bombs are blowing along the East Coast Railroad and no one can seem to know what to do, Mr. President, you got to do something. This is what a president does. He never sees an easy decision. And consequently, the great ones, have to make decisions on almost any range of problems involving almost, and many times, the interrelationships of almost all sciences, all knowledge, and he's got to have advisors. And they better be good at that level. They better be good at any level that amounts to anything in the political system. And you have your technical experts, your career specialists, your professional economists, and so on, your military experts. You have all of these experts surrounding the president. And then he has his political experts, the Ted Sorensens. No one ever sees them, but they're as close to this man as anyone could be. Every politician has a palace guard that's worth his salt. And it's interesting that Ted Sorensen writes today that he feels it's terribly important that they have a political background, the ultimate advisors, the real close palace guards, because the one basic error, or the one obvious error that the president made, President Kennedy, was the error in ordering the invasion of Cuba. And this was a decision he made on the basis of his military and intelligence experts. His political experts said, this doesn't look like the right thing to do. It may not work. And you better either do it right or don't do it at all. And he didn't listen to him. And he knew he made a mistake. And he never made the same mistake again, because he never relied wholeheartedly on technical or specialists from that day forth, as far as we can tell from the little bits of knowledge that are gradually seeping through. So a great and strong president has to have advisors, but they'll always only be advisors, because ultimately he has to make the decision. And any politician knows that he reaches a certain point, certain level of politics, he's going to be held responsible, no one else, if something goes wrong. It's kind of like, in any branch of the service, somebody takes the blame, and the elected official is generally the one that must accept this or reject it. And you've also got to remember another thing about politicians, that they're men usually who have reasonable self-confidence in themselves. I like to say we're the greatest egotists ever created, because basically we are elected, if we're worth anything, on our philosophy and our judgment. And if you don't believe in certain objectives, or you don't have any, shouldn't be in it in the first place, but you have to be a person that can take this kind of criticism, that can ultimately make decisions that are never going to be black or white, that are always going to have to be made on a very basis of judgment. And you're going to have to learn to set priorities, because there's never enough money to do what ought to be done in public life today. And there is never enough talent to really work over certain areas that ought to be worked over. And I could go into any area of state government, and they all ought to be priorities, really, in a society as affluent as ours, and how little attention we pay to a mental patient. $4, $5 a day we spend for a patient in a mental hospital, and the average hospital is $30, $35, $40 for private care. Correctional institution, it's almost a disgrace how little we spend to try to work on the most complicated social and economic problems that end up in prisons, and at Sauk Center for the girls, or at Red Wing or St. Cloud. And how little we do really in the various areas of the handicap and any number of areas. But basically, if you're a governor of this state, you've got to set certain priorities. You have to have a certain degree of confidence to carry on. And this is why I think you always are going to see politicians are always accused of being terrible egotists. And I guess in a sense, in some respects, this is the very nature of the office that in a sense helps to create them. And finally, you'll usually find that once a politician who's worth his salt arrives at a high office, he really believes in that office, and he looks upon it with great dignity. And he realizes that office must go on even if he's not there, and that he must uphold this office and the dignity of it as best he can, and to retain its power and its respect, because this is terribly important to just the structural aspect of governing. Decisions by politicians are always limited by time, by law, by resources, by tradition, and worst of all, by the lack of information. You sometimes don't have enough time. You don't have the information. I'm sure this is true on foreign policy. Many times the president is called upon to make decisions when he really doesn't have the full information he needs. And yet, he may have to make a decision for one reason or another. So what I'm trying to tell you is that basically political decision-making is quite unlike many other aspects of life that you're going to be dealing with in your own lives. It's quite different in many respects from business. When I hear people say we ought to run government like a business, I always say, well, what business can you kick the board of directors off every 2 or 4 years and throw out all the executives, the governor on down, every 4 years, and you can change the House every 2 years, and you can change as a matter of fact, the House usually does have a third turnover every time it runs. What business runs like this? I know of none. I know of none. It's not like a family. It's not like a union. It's not exactly like a farm organization. Matter of fact, it's its own entity which is changing and rechanging over and over again as the nation is developing. But basically, we that are in politics contend with powerful pressures, the other branches of the legislature, the other branches of government, I should say. I have to contend with the legislature and the judiciary. The legislature contends with the governor and the judiciary, and vice versa. The media, which I've discussed, and this whole problem of public opinion, which I've generally touched on, and the fact that ultimately we have to go to that public to get elected and to compete in the range of a public that is complex and that has had to absorb immense change in a very short time. It's my belief, I guess, that because of our concept as to the nature of man, we're better capable, and because of this political process, of making lasting decisions if we can retain these concepts. Now let me try to explain this. I don't think anybody can fundamentally make great decisions, not even politics and other areas as well, unless he's exposed to varying human value judgments. Totalitarian, Franco has never had a legislature since 1936. He's governed by edict, or I don't know how he handles it. He's got his own advisors and his heads, and they just write the laws. His system, in my judgment, will have difficulty making great decisions that will be lasting and will perpetuate the better aspects of the culture of that country, I suspect. The same can be said for almost any totalitarian. Mr. Sorensen has said that wise decisions will be made only by those whose wisdom is constantly challenged. But fundamentally, the politician who has to make these decisions will always have to have the concepts, the values, the data on which he's making decisions under challenge. And this is why it's terribly important to have the Augsburgs and the university and the Carltons because this is a good place to do the challenging. There aren't many others in this world where you can basically challenge the accepted precedents of our nation. And the founding fathers did not live in 1964. The founding fathers never dreamed of a hydrogen bomb. The founding fathers never conceived of a corporation. The founding fathers never conceived of a population which is, 20, 30, 40 times. What did America have? 3.5 million people. 13 little states. And yet they had some basically pretty fundamental ideas about the nature of man. And they're in those documents, that Bill of Rights, and a lot of the other aspects of the dispersion of power, the protection of minorities, the whole concept of discussion and dissent. I suspect our founding fathers didn't trust the masses very much. And trust them we must, and educate them and help them and be a part of it. So I doubt very much if there can be much wisdom without dissent in the long run. That there can be much progress without a lot of diversity. Because if you learn nothing else in politics, you'll learn that diversity basically is awfully healthy. And it can be a wonderful, I even kind of like Polish weddings, you know. If you've never been to a Polish wedding, that takes 3 days. Girls, there's never any divorces after you go through this ordeal. If you survive this, you're going to make her. If you've never been in a Slavic community, you ought to do this. Or you ought to go over to North Minneapolis and go out to the Peretz Community Center when they have the old folks come in once a year. The old workman's circle. These are Jewish people in their 70s that all came out of the ghettos of Kiev and Warsaw long before the Bolsheviks, I might add, and listen to them talk about America and how proud they are to be Americans, and they almost tears stream down your face as they tell you about it. And they all got together to learn how to speak English, and they've contributed uniquely. Matter of fact, I was taught by a German Jew who made a very clear decision about 3 weeks after Hitler got into power. He went back and read Mein Kampf, and he started believing him. And he said, I either stay here and die or I get out of here and live. And he made a pretty rational decision. He got out of there, and he lived. But we got to have this kind of diversity, because basically the whole world's diverse. Korea is different, and Koreans are different in many respects, although they're all humans. There's a great sameness, at the same time a lot of diversity. If we're ever going to live in peace, we've got to be able to handle this kind of diversity and this kind of dissent, and it's not easy. And yet I think our political process gives us some techniques and tools for doing it. And basically, this is what we've got to try to do. And we've got to try to develop a system where each one of you will take the responsibility, in part, to help to produce the kinds of political leaders who can make the kinds of decisions that have to be made in the kind of world that we live in today. And this is quite a different world, and it's going to be so much different. Your kids are going to be flying to the moon. This is no joke. We're going to be working on the property of outer space. We're going to be doing things that we never conceived of, building houses differently than we've ever built them, or bridges maybe out of aluminum, or doing things that man never dreamed of doing. And as I said, interestingly enough, we can also destroy ourselves. And I'm only asking that at least we try to develop and to work out the political institutions that can prevent these kinds of catastrophes from happening, and that can deal effectively with the fundamental problems of the world, not trivia. Most of politics is pretty much dealing in areas that don't have immense impact, but trying to deal with the very fundamental problems of war and peace, of really true civilization, having enough to eat, food over your head, having the dignity that each person has to feel if he's going to be able to contribute, and to feel a part, and to not want to be shooting one another. And I just hope that you'll remember that there are diversities of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are differences of administration, but the same Lord. Thank you very much. Now you can ask me about the 5% cut, or Professor Sibley, or anything else you want to take on. He's here tonight to defend himself. So. Yes.
How much effect will the passage of the taconite have been having in the legislation?
Well, I think, let me put it this way, it's hard to say what the amendment will have. The development and full utilization of taconite will have some impact on in terms of permanent employment. A taconite plant goes 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, because it's a huge investment, and they got to keep her moving. Matter of fact, the people that work in a taconite plant, all they're doing is repairing the equipment, keeping her going. And in that sense, it'll have if the plants are developed, now the question is whether they'd be developed or not with the taconite amendment, but let's assume that they won't develop them, that there are outside ores, there are other areas that the mining companies can go to, and that they wouldn't build them, then I think it would have some impact. But let me be very clear. This is only a beginning. This does not solve the problems of northeastern Minnesota. The entire mining industry by 1975 will not employ more than 12 to 14,000 people, and directly in mining. There'll be auxiliary services and so on, but this will give a certain degree of stability. I think basically it's more a psychological problem. There has to be diversity up there of industry. Otherwise, the out-migration will continue on. There has to be tremendously more diversified utilization of their resources, the water and the tourism and the pulp. And there has to be, obviously, the development of low-bulk, easy transportable industries. The Port of Duluth, of course, should be of great help to them eventually. This has been slow in developing, but this is a world port now. It brings goods all the way into the central section of this country, and I think ultimately will have an immense impact in terms of economics. So I guess mostly the taconite amendment itself was a political agreement reached between the mining companies and the Republican Party on the one hand, and the Democratic Party and the steelworkers on the other hand. And it's nothing, this is what's hard to explain to people, that the mining companies wanted, and when I speak of the mining companies, only one I'm really talking about, and that's the United States Steel Corporation, which has about 60 to 70% of the resource, the now developable resource, and that is the magnetic taconite. So they have said they won't build unless they get this amendment. So then we argue back and forth over, well, what kind of an amendment? We didn't want any amendment. So then they said, well, we had to have something. Well, then they said, well, we'll take 40 years. Well, that's too much. So we settle on 25. They want to cover both local and state taxes. No, you can't cover local taxes because we know the costs of education and most local services are going to go up. And we feel that we can't really agree on that. So they take out local taxes. And then we say, well, we've got to have a personal commitment. You got to come down to the legislature and tell them you'll build and where you're going to build. And you got to be willing to put the engineering costs out and so on to make sure that you're not just playing games. And they said they would be willing to do this. So this is what it is. It's an agreement which was reached to try to get this thing out of the terrible tensions of, first place, is in an area where we get a lot of votes. And it was splitting us right down the middle. Democratic Party on the one hand, we had Fred Sheena and Tom Vukolich, and many of our legislators pushing very hard for an amendment. On the other hand, we had Nick Krumpetich and some of the steel workers, and Vlad Shipka is a close personal friend of mine, opposing the amendment. And we tried to find some common ground that we could all agree on. Now, we didn't get everybody to agree on it, frankly, but we came about as close as we could. And again, this is principle versus what we thought the practical problems up there were. Now, we'd already passed a statute in the legislature which in effect does what the amendment does anyhow, and it would never change it anyhow, I'm afraid. But this was the kind of compromise we made based on the problem as we saw it on the Iron Range, and really it was hammered out by the two senators and the governor. Yes, sir.
May I ask you a very quick question on the taconite problem?
Sure.
How many taconite plants are there in existence now that are using Minnesota ore?
We have two large taconite facilities at Erie and Reserve, which is...
I mean, not outside the state, no.
There is some, and the U.S. Steel has a pilot plant at Mountain Iron. They have, outside there must be 16 or 20 taconite facilities all around.
Does that use Minnesota ore?
Oh, no. No, I don't know of any that use Minnesota ore. I don't know of any that use outside of our state.
The question here has to do with the institutional structure, the differentiation between a law and a constitution, a document, an amendment, changing an amendment to deal with an exigent state,
Yeah.
a strange business, and you change the amend the constitution to deal with the question of whether or not we should have religion taught in schools. The Becker Amendment comes to my mind.
Yes, that's right.
How long can we preserve the institution of our historical structure, the Catholic Constitution, to deal with exigent?
Well, of course, the Minnesota Constitution is kind of a monster to begin with, if I can use that word. I don't know how many times it's been amended, about 85 times, as I recall from my political science. It's got a lot of... It's a terribly poor document to begin with. It isn't nearly as flexible and well written as our United States Constitution. Matter of fact, there were two Minnesota Constitutions. No one knows which one's which now, which one we got, but there were two drafted at the time. Well, we've messed around with this Minnesota Constitution quite a bit, I guess is a fair way of saying it. Well, basically, I guess it comes down to the United States Steel's powerful. This is a powerful organization. And in many respects, it's more powerful than almost any person. And when men don't have jobs, you can take the Constitution, just heave it away. It isn't very meaningful. It's the first speech I ever gave was in Eveleth, Minnesota, 1962 in the summer. I remember Marion didn't know I was the same person after I came off that Iron Range. And one guy came up, he said, I gave what I thought was a great speech. The guy came up to me afterwards. I met him here last Saturday, he never forgot it. He grabbed me, he said, I never heard a man that knows less about an unemployed person than you. And he was right. And this is, what do you do? How do you get a corporation to invest $100 million? I don't know. This is one of the problems of an industrial democracy. That corporation makes $1.5 billion a year, profits net. That makes the state of Minnesota kind of look like nothing, sort of a little dwarf here. This corporation is bigger than any state, I guess, maybe by size, New York and California. Did you ever think of that? We'll try to negotiate with them.
others may see because of us. Keep us from following other lights that glitter for a while and then die. Let us not be dazzled by lesser loyalties, but keep us true to Thee. Thank you, God, for this ministry that has been ours with these young people. Bless them and keep them for Thy special glory. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. As the doors of Children's Chapel close, we wish to thank you for worshiping with us. Children's Chapel is produced by L.M. Sulzer for the National Lutheran Council, Department of Radio and Television. This is your host, Gene Larson, saying goodbye and God bless you until we meet again in Children's Chapel. lausnirlaust, neinægirhimilustna, uselnagna, jálnuk, nesensalist og hræsisi, uselnalækna uidervötna papi, smackner through China, the first smell out to the silhasnerlust.
Interesting thing, the other taconite companies, Erie and Reserve, now they're made up of a number of corporations, steel-producing corporations. You want to remember the steel industry is an integrated industry. They own everything from the pellets, or from the ore in the ground, to the finished product. And the Erie company is made up of a number of steel corporations, as is Reserve, and they each take a certain share of the pellets. They went together in a joint venture. And we've always treated them very well, actually. I mean, very fairly. The U.S. Steel is the one that the economic war went on up on the Iron Range. They've never had the kind of management of a Bob Linney of Reserve or a Mr. Abner of Erie. Very, I think, progressive, thoughtful. They'd never asked for something like this. But there are people that will. And as you know, one political party, that's all they were talking about. That's the Republican Party. And half the Democratic Party in the range, and not to mention some of our others. The politicians can't live very long with extreme tensions. They got to try to find some common ground. You know, this is a lot of times it takes almost like a rail strike for Johnson to get them together and sort of make them sit there till they resolve it. This is sort of the nature of, we'll do anything to avoid a fight if we can help it. It's a very interesting process, but I guess you fundamentally get down in this case to a very powerful institution, two powerful institutions, the state and the thing that's unequal in the whole struggle are that the political institutions, the two parties, really aren't very strong in the last analysis. They're good in this state. I'm not saying that, but basically they don't have much institutional base. We got no churches or colleges, Democratic college or the Republican college. We haven't got. Perhaps there's only 0.5% that really take an active part in any political party. I saw one study in the 1956 presidential election. Only 25% of the population did anything positive to elect either candidate, President Eisenhower or Mr. Stevenson. In other words, even go up and say, "I wish you'd vote for me." These were studies done at the University of Michigan or Michigan State, I don't remember, but there's very little interest, actually, in the political parties. Basically are run by a very few people. And of course, this is the competence. When I first went to my first caucus, I think Mary and I went, how many people were there? I think just you and I. And we had 5 votes, right off the bat at the county convention. Just take an interest in either political party and you'll find yourself zooming to the top so fast that you'll hardly know how to control it, because there really aren't a lot of people. And I might say the two political parties in Minnesota, I think, in comparing them to others, are exceptionally good and exceptionally competent. But they sure need talent all the time. They say we're a little top-heavy right now, but really that isn't true. Are there any other... This is a very mild audience. I usually get chewed to pieces, but it's an interesting life. Yes.
It seems to me that our country is really facing some serious crises in the future. The crises of civil rights, the crises of automation, so-called cybernetic revolution, this type of thing. And my concern is whether or not our government is capable to react responsibly to these crises. Or isn't it true that there may be a necessity for some serious reorganization of our governmental structures? If this is true, where does the push for this reorganization of government itself come from?
Boy, that's a tough one. Well, let me say first, there's no question in my mind that basically, in terms of the future of the nation as a great nation, as a leading nation, will depend on how it handles this racial problem. That's not to say that there isn't discrimination in almost every country of the world, because there is in one form or another. But most other countries aren't the leaders, and this is what makes us a little different. And the basic political problems that this is presenting at this time, matter of fact, I doubt if any of us in this room are going to see any lessening of racial tensions for the next 20 years, unless we start shooting at each other. In other words, the problem, and this goes so deep in your culture that to begin to resolve it, we're going to have to keep this kind of pressure, it seems to me, on the people for a long period of time until justice is done in this particular area. And the real test, basically, we have seen. The whole question had to be brought to focus through the Supreme Court. It couldn't be done through the elective process. This is true. You could never have passed a segregation, an integration of school bill through the Congress of the United States. Couldn't have been done. So the question is now, can they pass a bill which is really fairly moderate? And I guess I think they can, but it's going to be watered down some in the process. And will the country, or can the white majority in this country, can they accept and absorb the kinds of pressures the minority people are going to put on us and continue to put on us for the next 20 years? And I guess we, if given enough time, we can probably handle it fairly well through our institutional structures, mainly because the problem is confined, at least in part, to one region. In terms of the legislation, you can rammer around these people if you're willing to hang in there long enough, and you can out-talk them and eventually keep progress moving. Also, the office of the presidency is becoming more powerful all the time. And if we got men that'll use it, President Eisenhower wouldn't do this. But I think you have to. And same with the governor. Governor is this state. The whole structure of state government is putting power into the hands of the legislature and weakening the executive, and it's got to be reversed, in my judgment. Now, this automation is tougher in many respects, even than the civil rights, in the sense that we basically have not. We're great planners in private industry. The Mayo Clinic sits down there and plans 25 years ahead of time. They got committees figuring out how many buildings they got to have, how much staff, what's medicine going to be like, is it going to be socialized to a certain extent, and if so, what is it going to do to that institution? This is what they're thinking about all the time. But government's never beyond the crisis. So it seems this is Gunnar Myrdal's thesis, really, this recent book he's written. And this is the area that really bothers me. I've seen it in the Minnesota Senate. I've seen too much power in the hands of too few, and an almost impossible problem of trying to change and try to plan. What really worries me is too often in America, it seems to me, we don't plan, and that the crisis comes, we have to do something, we set up a bureaucracy or set up something to try to deal with it, and then it's harder than the devil to get rid of it when we don't need it. And we've never really, in a political sense, been mature enough. We've also had new land or new areas to move in. We've never had to basically deal with a tremendous increase in population with nowhere to go, plus the technological revolution on top of it. And this is going to change our structure, I think, to a certain extent. I think, of necessity, the office of presidency is going to become a more powerful. Congress really isn't equipped to deal with foreign policy, except in a sort of a reflective sense, like Mr. Fulbright and others that can speak out on it. The role of the states is going to be interesting, because the states are going to fall apart politically, in my judgment, unless they do some radical changing. And reapportionment has to come, and has to be done fairly and swiftly. The states are going to have to spend a lot more money, if they just want to keep up and do what states were traditionally set up to do, that is, educate the people. We spend 55 cents out of every dollar in this state of state taxes for education. And we have a $400 million state budget now, and in 8 years I predict it'll be $1 billion for the biennium. If we're going to, we've polluted almost every river in Minnesota now. just kind of, it's almost unbelievable. I was up in Wilmer the other day, that beautiful little lake. It's just a cesspool. Not only the city, but the state's dumped all the state hospital, pumped their stuff in there. I'll tell you, it doesn't take long to pollute something. It's like building a university. It may take 100 years to develop a great university, and it takes about 10 to tear it down, you know. It takes a few Milt Rosens, and you can really, I'm not using that as an example, not personally in any sense of the word. But just to handle pollution, and obviously the state can't handle it alone. The Blotnick, Mr. Congressman, is almost every sewage plant in Minnesota is built with federal money, in part. Any great program of pollution control and water control is going to have, due to the very nature of the nation, the mobility and the interrelationship and the crossing of state lines and so on, is going to have, in part, the federal government, at least in certain parts of it. Many times I've been thinking how we handle corrections. For instance, everybody that's over 25 that commits a felony goes to Stillwater. I don't know if you've ever been over there. This is not a very magnificent institution, but you throw everything from murderers, from hard-bitten, incorrigibles to other persons who I'm sure are rehabilitatable in the real sense of the word, with proper staff and so on, into one prison. The federal system, the hardened ones, they used to shoot to Alcatraz. I guess they closed that down now. They put them in Leavenworth. The drug addicts go a certain place. In other words, they try to work out a system of rehabilitation and try to have prisons that meet certain types of problems and to staff them with people that are competent. The states don't go together to do this. We really can hardly afford to have a women's prison. We only have 50 women. You girls will be proud of yourselves. After you're 18, you get in less trouble than we males. We have about, I suppose, 1,800 males over the 18 incarcerated and only 50 women. When they're under 18, we have just as many at Sauk Center usually as we have at Red Wing. I don't know why that, but apparently women don't go to jail as much. But basically, we're going to have to see states interrelate far more. I'm sure the university's doing this already in certain areas. It's going to have to do it a lot more. Colleges are doing it, like Amherst and Smith and Holyoke. Not only do the boys and the girls get together now, but even the teachers get together. It's amazing. What changes are going to be made constitutionally are hard to predict. I'm sure that the decision-making process is going to have to be speeded up. Obviously, we're going to have yearly sessions. The legislature, it seems to me, this is foolish. You kind of run the state government like a grocery store. If the legislature is going to have any meaning, it's got to have a research staff, competent people, working year-round on state problems. This is a billion-dollar business we're talking about. And we're going to have to operate it like one. Obviously, if your governor is going to mean anything, he should be able to appoint his own commissioners. In other words, the commissioners ought to go in with him. If he's got a program, he can't change anything the way it is now. They stagger him, and the governor gets in there and has a program, and Commissioner X says, "I don't like that program, Governor," and he's sitting there. So what's he going to do? So unless we realign the basic power structure in the state, give the governor the authority, give him the power of appointment to try to execute a policy, and get the legislature meeting regularly and wrestling with these problems each year, we're not going to be able to do what has to be done. And obviously, we're either going to develop other, like broader municipal forms. County government may become more prominent. I think it will. We're going to have to just develop other units of government to handle these kinds of problems, or they're going to be handled. Just like they just gave up in the 30s. The poor mayors of these cities, there's terrible welfare problems, enormous problems of health. They just went to the federal government finally. They just batted their brains at the doors of the legislatures for 6 or 8 years, and then they took off for Washington. And that's where they can lay the votes down. Mayor Daley can put a lot of votes out of Chicago for the guy he's he's running for senator or for the presidency, and he'll get some action down there where he can't dent this process here in the state. So somebody, I was out the other day talking about cybernation, and I stopped in and saw one of the great old men of Minnesota, Ben DuBois in Sauk Center, the home of Sinclair Lewis. And he says flatly, automation will lead to socialism. I didn't have enough time to press him on this. He's kind of a wonderful guy, you know. He's married to a Catholic lady, and he won't go to church. And if you want to see diversity and dissent in one family, you come on out there and listen to those two go at it. But we're going to have, I think, some rather dramatic changes, I think, basically in the structure of government. But it's hard for me to decide. Yes?
I'd like to maybe say something about the responsibility of the academic community. Now, obviously, the responsibility of a political leader is, in a sense, shared with the political responsibility of the department, the state. Now, you represent an academic community. Would you like to say something to us who are faculty, us who are students, and from your background and experience in school and society? What do you think we ought to do?
Well, I guess teachers are like anybody else. I think a lot of them lack some backbone. I think they have a tremendous responsibility, not only to, I guess, communicate the cultural values of a society, but to bring her under question all the time. And obviously, those of us in politics have to provide you, in a sense, and certainly with the public institutions, the ability to do this, but in the private schools, I think in many respects they're freer. In some private schools. But I think the American teacher, one, hasn't been forceful enough in expounding, in forging new ideas and in expounding them to the general public. A lot of times they're pretty good at writing them in these journals that no one reads but the rest of the community of intellectuals. But somebody's going to talk to the 180 million, and all the new ideas fundamentally are going to come out, or a good share of them, out of the research and the examination that goes on here, and too often, and I take full blame for this, we politicians are just out of touch, really. The intellectual in the academic community is not bringing to the politician or communicating with him or the public very well. And of course, another thing that always amazes me is when a problem such as the question of academic freedom arises, the teachers sometimes run for the hills quicker than anybody, and they're about the last ones to open their mouths in terms of what it seems to me is just elementary to the very reason they're teachers. So I guess I think that obviously they've got this enormous responsibility to be objective and to teach and to question and so on. But I think they do have to stand up and be counted. And the history of teachers in terms of what happens when the totalitarians begin to move is not a very encouraging one. In Hitler's Germany, the teachers hardly raised a word when he issued the edict, which in effect meant that all the humanities, or all the ideas, and all the courses in the humanities had to clear through the German Department of Information, which is Mr. Goebbels' outfit. And the interesting thing was there were very few that really stood up and were counted. And the one story the only one I remember is the Hans Berger. There were 7 of them that got up at the courtyard at the University of Munich and protested that this was a bad thing and ought to be opposed. And Hitler shot them all the next day. They buried them that night. And that was the end of free inquiry in Germany from that day forth, because the teachers just shut up and were afraid. So it seems to me that the academic community has got to really speak out as forcefully as possible, and that's not to say a lot of them don't, but especially with these basic problems. Population. What politician is going to talk about population today? You know, he's no Joan of Arc. I'll give you a good example of this. I was speaking at an Isaac Walton League meeting the other day, about almost been 6 months ago, and I was telling them we got a lot of people, you know, and you know, there are hardly enough pheasants to go around, and this guy came up to me after and he whispered. He said, "Sandy," he said, "the whole problem is too many people. Go up and tell them that." And I said, "Well, why don't you?" And he said, "Oh, half these people get mad at me if I ever tell. Boy, there's a lot of religious people in that group. And I, what do you want me to do? Go out there and hang myself? If you won't do it, why do you think I'm going to stand out there?" And but this is a problem. If the academic community doesn't do some work on this area, I don't know the answers. And maybe it can feed how many more billion I was reading the other day. I read a book by this professor from St. Thomas the other day, and I was reading, I haven't finished it, on Latin America, and it seems that their population is increasing faster than their productivity, and they're going downhill. Now, if that's true, that's enough to scare you right out of your wits, because whereas we're going to double our population in we're going up about 3 million a year, 3.5 million a year, 30-some years, we're going to double ours. They're doubling theirs in half the time. And their standard of living is somewhere, what, $100 a month? I mean, $100 a year, some incredible thing. But who's really talking about this? It better come, basically, from the universities and the colleges, because as it does, I guess a politician's like anything else. If there's nobody to protect him, if he hasn't got any troops back home, there's nobody he isn't going to stand out there alone very long. It just isn't human nature. And the best protection he can have is a good, intellectually based community. Because in this world we live in, without the intellectual community providing the sustenance for democracy, she's going to go down the drain awful fast. And if that community isn't willing even to stand up and be counted on these very basic problems, and I just use population, I really don't know the answers. This is one area that I'm really ignorant on, and I should be learning them, because I'm sure this is fundamental. Cybernation, how much information are we really getting on this particular problem? It's quite limited, really, as far as I can tell, in the average, ordinary, run-of-the-mill press. And in terms of foreign relations and so on, it's terribly limited. The one problem we're bringing into focus is the racial problem, and this is just being forced on us. And this is one that's really, it's almost getting under people's skin. A lady stopped me in the street today, and she said, "Golly, I wish they'd pass that bill." She said, I just, every night on the television is some sit-in or slow up, or she said, just give them their due. It was interesting. She's getting tired of it. Well, maybe this is a good sign. I don't know. If the boys hold tough, I think they'll make her. There's no compromise. There's not much room to compromise here. But this is a hard one. I know teachers don't like to take unpopular views, I suspect, any more than I do, in one sense of the word. But and the whole concept of freedom as we know it is so different from many times the way you're brought up even. There's a lot of authoritarian families in this world, unfortunately. To be able to live with people with different ideas is not easy, and to be able to really not get all excited and exercise when somebody says something that offends you in certain, say, in your religion and so forth. This is not an easy. You're living in a tough system, and yet I say I don't think great decisions can come out of any society that isn't put under these kinds of intellectual and almost emotional pressures in order to basically evolve a people towards a sense of equality, which doesn't say everybody's equal, but at least they got equal opportunities, and to keep people from shooting one another, and to work with reason and persuasion instead of force. I guess I would say that the key is the intellectual community, if you can pick any one factor. Too often, of course, and maybe they have to, most political scientists won't even mess around in either of the political parties. I've had a long discussion with a couple of them on this point. They feel they will lose a certain degree of their objectivity, at least this one did, and that he felt he had to step back and to stay out of because the parties do get very emotional, and party fights and so on. I've been through one recently myself, and just about ruined my life for a month. But yet at the same time, if they'll carry out their function, and then I really don't worry too much about it. I mean, in terms of we'll pick it up. I'm not afraid to act. One, if the facts are there, and two, if there's somebody to support me. This is a terrible feeling, and if you don't feel you got any support, you just have a terrible time stepping out in front of the troops.
What about the student here? If you think back on your student life, a good preparation for the role that you play. Question between being academically disciplined and also actively involved in community affairs, this kind of business.
Well, I think the college I went to was not a good cross-section. This was Amherst College is a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant college, so to speak. It's up middle class, and it didn't have a good cross-section. I never knew there were, thoughtful steelworkers until I met thoughtful steelworkers. And I do think colleges should be careful and try to, especially the smaller liberal arts one, try to get a good cross-section of people. I think it's a wonderful training. I think this is to have competently trained persons. I think that if a student really, wants to work and wants to be here and wants to take what there is here, he's going to be a long ways ahead of most people in terms of when he has to face the basic, so many fundamental problems. I mean, just picking a wife. It's kind of fundamental, boys, I'm telling you. Make sure you pick the right one. Picking a job. And to have a college education behind you, you're just about 3-4 steps ahead of those that don't. And in terms of what you can do, it's very helpful. But this sure doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of wise people that never enter a college or a university. Because I sure learned that quickly. And but I certainly I thought Amherst did a very good job in some areas, and As I said, I didn't have a good cross-section till I went to law school, till they just took them on grades and tests. I think 60% of my class was Jewish at Yale Law School. Matter of fact, they used to discriminate against me just so I'd know how it felt. That used to be their boys. This was the first time, I'd ever seen kids that had. Matter of fact, my roommate at law school, I think he had 30 cents a day to live on. Oscar Rouse, he's a very prominent lawyer today. Came out, his mother and dad didn't even speak English. The east side of New York. I never did know how he nutritionally ever got through that institution, but he did. And his mother just taught him when he was a little boy, if you're a Jew, you got to work harder. And he worked hard. That's the biggest contribution I got to my campaign was from him. That's